The Long Road by Wolfland. As Credilli materialized onto the battlefield, Stephen noticed that the shadows that had appeared during Banette's fight hadn't vanished, and oddly enough, they began to pool onto Phoebe's side of the arena. Credilli trilled, sensing his nervous glance at the lingering darkness, and he gave her a reassuring smile. "They're just shadows, but stay on your guard just in case." Credilli nodded and swiveled her gaze back towards their opponent, narrowing her eyes as she waited for Phoebe's next Pokemon. The elite's expression was tight as she brought forth her third Pokeball, and as she threw it, Stephen swore the darkness that hung heavily around her feet seemed to swirl in a non-existent breeze. The hollow roar of a Dusclops cut through his thoughts, and his focus snapped back to the battle at hand. As Credilli bristled with nervous energy, Stephen scowled, deep in thought. A repeat Pokemon on Phoebe's team surely wouldn't be a carbon copy of the first. She had to have a different trick up her sleeve. They'd just have to play it safe until they figured it out. "Credilli, keep your distance! Use Ancient Power!" Chunks of rock lifted up and shot towards Dusclops as Credilli made the first move. But as boulders rained all around, Phoebe watched quietly as her Pokemon's two massive hands came up and caught the largest of the projectiles and crushed it between its palms. Credilli squeaked in surprise at the way her attack was so easily shed, but she buckled down and prepared a second volley. Except she never got the chance to unleash it. "Disable!" Phoebe's voice rang out in time with Dusclops' movements, and it faced Credilli with both palms turned outward, launching a shockwave that left Credilli stunned. Her tendrils drooped, and the beginnings of her next ancient power died midair and crumbled to the ground. Stephen grimaced at their predicament. Credilli had no other ranged attacks, and after Dusclops' raw display of power, he had no interest in getting up close and personal with their foe. But if they had no choice... "Confuse Ray, Credilli!" His partner obeyed, and this time, her tentacles lifted back up, waving to and fro in a dizzying display. Dusclops' eye drifted side to side in time with Credilli's movements, until it finally settled at the bottom of its socket, half-lidded and unfocused. But as the ghost wobbled unsteadily on its feet, Phoebe's hand came to bear, and with a thrust, she urged her partner forward. "Dusclops! Ice Punch!" The confused Pokemon wobbled only a moment longer before it snapped to attention as if by the sheer force of Phoebe's will. Fully alert, its eye focused on Credilli for a split second before it launched itself across the battlefield faster than such an unwieldy Pokemon had any right to be moving. Dusclops' right hand drew back as it closed in, an icy blue aura surrounding its fist. Eyes wide, Stephen jolted forward in the challenger's box with a panicked shout. "Catch it!" At the last minute, Credilli's tendrils shot forward, wrapping tight around Dusclops' body and halting its advance. Several other tendrils had wound themselves around its fist, trembling in the effort to keep its punch at bay. Credilli's neck strained against the powerful ghost type, and it slowly pushed back against her tenuous hold, inching closer and closer, until the red glow of its eye cast an eerie light across Credilli's armor. The icy air around Dusclops' restrained hand continued to swirl, and soon the cold seeped into Credilli's tentacle, sending a wince through her frame as her strength began to fail. "Credilli, you can do it! Giga Drain!" But Stephen's shout came too late. He had been so focused on Dusclops' right hand that he had completely missed how its left had taken a red-hot glow of its own. The fire punch connected with the side of Credilli's head in a vicious blow, and as her head snapped to the side from the force of the punch, her hold on Dusclops' other fist let go. In an explosion of frost, the second punch landed squarely to the top of Credilli's helm, driving her face first into the arena floor. The follow-through of the attack was so strong, it uprooted her grip on the ground, and her legs writhed uselessly as she curled in on herself from the pain with a shuddering wail. With a satisfied huff, Dusclops phased through the few tentacles that feebly clung to its midsection. It regarded the downed fossil Pokemon with a look of distaste, and Steven paled when, instead of backing off, it raised one massive foot in a stomp aimed right for Credilli's head. Hand shaking, Steven stared in disbelief as Dusclops' foot came down on nothing but the remnants of Credilli's recall beam. Hey! What are you thinking? The round was already over! You didn't have to have your Pokemon attack again! Steven definitely did not withhold the accusatory tone in his shout at the Ghost-type specialist, but his sharp stare faltered when Phoebe met his gaze from across the battlefield. An unsettling smile tugged at the corners of her cheeks, and the way her eyes seemed to have sunk deep into the shadow set the hair at the back of his neck on end. We have to win. Any trace of the lilt in her voice had vanished, the words unnervingly hollow as they droned from her lips. We can't let it happen. What? He only dared to whisper the first question before he asked the second aloud. Let what happen? You wouldn't understand, came the cryptic reply. Only they understand. So pick your next Pokemon. Warily, Steven obeyed the elite's directive, distinctly aware of the clamminess of his palms as he selected Aggron's ball from his belt. The massive steel type appeared with a roar, and this time, Steven was sure he saw the shadows dance and curl around Phoebe's ankles like dark serpents. But Dusclops gave him no room to confirm his suspicions, and Aggron was immediately on the defensive as the Ghost-type lunged, fists aglow. Its first two swings were parried by Aggron's claws, but the elemental power of each attack lingered wherever Dusclops made contact, and Aggron winced as the third blow merely glanced off of it. Steven frowned as Dusclops made ready to throw another punch. The flurry of his attacks was too heavy to rely on pure defense. Drive it back! And keep it at bay with Thunderbolt! As Dusclops swung, Aggron spun, pivoting in time with the blow so that the fire punch only left a blackened scrape against its armor. From the momentum of the spin, it then brought its tail around and clubbed Dusclops in the side, sending the ghost stumbling backward. By the time Dusclops had gathered itself and prepared to renew its attack, electricity rained down from above, and its eyes squeezed shut as it shuddered to a halt. But it only faltered momentarily before it brought a palm to bear and sealed Aggron's attack with another wave of disable. The electricity fizzled out of Aggron's horns, but Steven wasn't worried. He'd already come up with their plan of attack, except that, yet again, the Elite's ghosts had another trick up their sleeve that threw all his plans out the window. Infestation! Phoebe's single command sent her Pokemon into a frenzy. With a shuddering lurch, Dusclops' fingers curled inward as it screeched, and Aggron's eyes went wide as the bandages encircling the ghost's body began to loosen. From between the gaps in the cloth, something began to stir. Shivering, Dusclops howled, expelling a massive wave of shadowy bugs from deep within its bandages. The chittering swarm of legs and wings poured forth and swept over Aggron, toppling the beast beneath its sheer weight. Aggron! Steven's shout nearly was drowned out by the hissing and shrieking of the creatures, but as he held his breath, one silvery claw surfaced through the wave of insects and swatted a clump of the swarm away. Dragging itself upright, Aggron roared as it swung its tail through the mass, batting bugs left and right. It was panting from the effort by the time it stood back on both hind legs, and patches of its armor were still full of the squirming creatures, but its gaze was locked on Dusclops with fiery determination. The ghost Pokemon narrowed its own stare at the steel type and hunkered into ready stance, palms outward, each glowing with their elemental auras. Steven's pulse thrummed in his ears as the battlefield lapsed into a silent standoff, neither Pokémon willing to make the first move. It suddenly felt a lot harder to breathe. The air was thick with shadows and dust. Then, without warning, both Pokémon lunged at once. Aggron met Dusclops' ice-coated fist in a vicious clash that sent the Ghost-type reeling back, but not before its fiery hand clamped down on Aggron's neck and squeezed, heating the armor plates until they glowed red. Aggron howled in anguish and lashed out with its tail, batting the Ghost Pokémon away. Dusclops stumbled backward, but quickly regained its composure and leapt forward with another Fire Punch primed to strike. But this time, Aggron was ready, and Dusclops' fist bounced harmlessly off the blue energy of Protect's shield. Off balance again, Dusclops was unable to set its feet before Aggron drove forward with another Iron Head. Its helm met Dusclops' right hand in defense, but the force of the lunge drove Aggron's horns through the ghost palm, garnering a roar of pain as its horns lodged into Dusclops' chest. Steven had watched the furious exchange with bated breath, mentally counting down the seconds, and seeing their chance materialize, he shouted as loud as he could, "Thunderbolt! Now!" A snarl ripped from Aggron's throat as Dusclops' eye widened in surprise. Disable's effect had worn off, and the crackle of electricity sounded from within the hollow shell of its body. Sparks surged from Aggron's horns, and the Ghost Pokémon jerked backward as the Thunderbolt fried its bandages until they began to smoke. Sliding its horns free, Aggron let Dusclops slump to the ground, paralyzed. It quivered as it tried to stand, moaning pitifully with each failed attempt. Sparing a glance across the battlefield, Steven saw that Phoebe seemed to be frozen in place, wide eyes locked onto where Dusclops had fallen. Her hands had balled into fists at her sides in an attempt to stop them from shaking. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. He didn't need to hear her whisper. The desperate word was clear on her lips. "No!" But the round was not over, and with the image of Dusclops' stomp fresh in his mind, Steven ignored Phoebe's silent plea and coldly gave his next command. "Earthquake!" Aggron's jaw twisted into a nasty grin as it brought its leg down in a thunderous stomp, triggering the quake. Dusclops' wail of pain was drowned out by the rumbling earth, and it quickly succumbed to the sheer power of Aggron's attack. "No!" This time, Steven did hear Phoebe's voice drift over the battlefield, and when he looked to her again, his brow knitted in confusion. "No! No! No!"